And joining us is a lady who is no stranger to the Observer. Let me say a pleasant good evening to political scientist Dr. Indira Rampersad.
Hi, good evening. Good evening, Mikey. How are you?
Well, I'm a lot better hearing your voice, I can tell you that. Thank you so much for taking time out to link with us here this evening. Well, it's the day after, and of course, I have to ask you the question. I mean, there was celebrity endorsements, there were stars, there were singers, there were actors. There were so many people who got caught up in this movement, the woman's power. We heard it day and night. I mean, here it is. We are in TNT, and we feel a bit exhausted. It's been a long campaign. What went wrong?
So it was a close race. We have to keep that in mind. It was a very close race. So we would not want to discuss the celebrity endorsement. We don't want to the celebrity endorsement or dismiss the long campaign and the gender factor and everything else that went with it. We have to keep in mind that such is the nature of politics, and a day is a lifetime in the political arena. What I think may have led to the results, the outcome, is I don't think that the middle group, which Kamala Harris is supposed to be courting, were interested in some of these issues. So I think she was speaking to the flock. Gender issues, abortion rights, anti-abortion rights, anti-gay rights. So I mean, should I say anti-homophobia rights? I should say. These are liberal values and liberal uh, ideologies that the liberal school adhere to. But there was a group that she was supposed to court, and that group was neither Democrat nor Republican, which is like neither PNM nor UNC till I did, a middle group. And I think that group may have disappointed. Some may not have voted, and some would have voted Trump. So we look and we see, I saw some statistics today, and it's early days, so they may be preliminary, but the statistics were actually showing, that all the groups, whether it was Latino, whether it was white, or whether it was um, black, all the groups had the votership had reduced from 2020 to 2024. Minimally so, but sufficient to have made the difference. So she lost some Latino votes, she lost some black votes, and she lost some white votes from 2020 to 2024, meaning that Biden got 50.9% of the vote and she got 47.4% of the vote, which you are actually showing on the screen. So she lost some votes from 2020. What accounted for that? It can also be that the woman or the gender factor backfired, and that Americans generally are not ready for a female president. Hillary
Yeah.
Clinton went against Donald Trump and lost. Kamala Harris went against Donald Trump and lost. Donald Trump epitomizes, in my opinion, a macho white man. That's one. But more than that, a macho white rich man. And Americans, I think money and materialism mean a lot to them. And one of the things that we have to do is to analyze the American psyche. And I'm speaking generally. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. I'm speaking generally, and that's what political scientists do. We look at general pattern, not the exceptions. That's a
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
analysis. So the general pattern, I think, in the U.S. dollar, the back of it is "In God We Trust." And so I think that element of materialism, the fact that Trump is a successful businessman, symbolizes him as he's a symbol. He represents wealth, and he represents power, and he represents
No, when
money.
you talk about those groups, I mean, let's look at, for example, here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I want us to look at these things and mirror exactly what is going on here in our society. There's always a group of people who simply the message that is going out, and I agree with what you're saying. they feel as though they've been exempted from that message. Those who simply want to put their shoulders to the wheel, they want to be productive, and the economy will always be a prime factor for them. They're not there for handouts, they're not there for hampers, they don't want assistance, but they simply want to know that the contribution that they are making is going to lead to something productive where they can elevate themselves and the lives of their family. Did Kamala Harris miss that point, that sector of people? Because based on the results we've seen in the mainstream cities, of course, the metropolitan cities, of course, people who came out. But we're talking about more of the rural areas where people were talking about inflation and those things that were hitting them directly. Did she miss that mark?
Yeah, I think she did. I think she wasn't driving home her points. Because I was listening to her over the weeks of campaign, particularly in the last week. And what I found is that the points she were making were not resonating. It was not coming across clearly. The economy, she was not driving it home sufficiently. And this happened in 2016 when Trump won against Hillary Clinton as well. It was a Rust Belt group, blue collar workers, rural people who they had issues with health care, the Obamacare, which was what Obama had instituted at the time. They had issues with employment. They had issues. This is pre-COVID. They had all kinds of economic issues, and I don't think she drove home that economic point very clearly. What she was going to do to assist this underprivileged group in the rural areas. Now, even in some of the big cities she lost, and some of those are the traditionally red seats, and we have to keep that in mind as well. And those are traditional Trump supporters. But whatever she was saying, and she said a lot, but when I tried to sift what she was saying and what was clearly her point, I think it wasn't coming across forcefully enough. I think it is probably the manner in which she speaks or the manner in which her speeches were written. Something went wrong. Trump, however, campaigned very strongly he campaigned on democracy, interestingly, but he did it forcefully. I mean, the average person wouldn't think that Trump is the biggest Democrat, but the way he did it, so it's how you convey the message. It's how you convey the message. Sometimes it's not a messenger, but the manner in which the message is conveyed. Yeah. And the other issue that he drove home very, very forcefully is immigration. He's always touted an anti-immigrant policy, and that is a nationalist card that he plays, that he played in 2016, that he replayed. He replayed that. It was a stock record in 2024. And that got it because many Americans, and interestingly, Mikee, Americans who were immigrants, but today are American citizens, or they may have a green card, they're residents of the U.S., they resent immigrants. It's a very interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, you also mentioned, of course, the fact of and I'll get to the issues that, as far as his policies, the president-elect. But you mentioned that issue of gender. And the thing about the electorate is that they're going to put you where they want you, where they feel comfortable. They're going to put someone there who they believe that they can go to bed at night and knowing that if something goes wrong, that person can defend their democracy and, of course, defend them as a citizen. That's how they feel. Now, when you talk about that, are we seeing something similar playing out here, not based on gender, but ethnicity? For example, what's happening in the PNM. Is there going to be a problem putting someone in charge of a political party that is not, of course, is outside of the Afro-Trinbagonian ethnicity?
And it has never happened before in the PNM. So I think the PNM stalwarts, particularly the Afro-PNM stalwarts, within and outside the party are looking on warily at this twist, and many are not happy about it. So for the Prime Minister to have openly endorsed that candidate who is non-Afro is worrying for a lot of them.
Yeah, but let me ask you this, Dr. Rampersad. Doesn't that show up the fact that we lack that political maturity after all of these years, that ethnicity would be an issue? Because when I go back and I think about it, like my grandfather would always say, he would say some of the worst things about the PNM, but he would always end by saying, at the end of the day, I'm sticking with my own. And he had this deep-rooted belief that it was people who looked like him and perhaps were educated like him that were actually pulling the strings, when in fact, that's a whole different conversation. But after all these years, is that still embedded in the psyche that sticking with my own, having this ethnic face, whether cosmetic or not, it means something to the people?
Well, totally. And this is what ethnicity means. It means that, you are subscribing to the views of a race of people who look like you. And that may just be a perception. Someone said, Benedict Anderson wrote that this is an imagined community. It's an imagined community because we heard Dr. Rowley was called an Oreo. And, there are many people who think that he doesn't represent his people and he doesn't support his people. We hear that, right? But the perception by the people is that you look like me and therefore you are going to represent me, and when the opposite may be totally true. So this ethnic factor is actually the most powerful political force in the face of the world. I mean, a lot of people don't like to engage it. They say you're talking race. But from an academic perspective, in which I am an academic, it is the factor that has triggered the Israel-Palestine war, the Israel-Palestine conflict for decades, right. The Russian-Ukraine war to some extent, the Guyana-Venezuela dispute to some extent, that's both territorial as well as oil, but there is also that, it's two different cultures. And many wars, India, Pakistan, Kashmir, the Kashmir border issue, religion is part of this ethnic war that triggers, this ethnic factor that triggers these global conflicts. Ethnicity plays a powerful role in domestic politics in the United States, in Trinidad and Tobago, in the UK, in Canada. These are all multicultural societies. We are all multicultural, we are melting pots. And ethnicity will always play a role. So we never discount, in analyzing politics, we never discount the ethnic groups. In Trinidad, we look at the Indian, we look at the Afro, we look at the mixed, we look at even to some extent the Chinese, Syrians and other groups. In the US, they look at the white, they look at the black, they look at the Latino in particular, So in the UK now you have huge class of Indo groups, Chinese groups. So they look at all these different groups and they analyze, not of course excluding the white vote. So Trump may not have been attractive to many of them, but he certainly attracted enough to push him over.
And that's my point. My point is, one would think that when really and truly, when you look at what played out here, Trump, of course, did not. Was not compatible when many people would talk about moral turpitude and having these values that people hold so highly. I mean, the fact of his court cases and what have you. But what eclipsed all of that was the fact that there were people who simply wanted to survive on a daily basis. And one would think that here in Trinidad and Tobago, at this point in time, with the issue of crime and the economy, that the whole factor of the ethnicity would not be a part, but yet still it is playing a very pivotal role in all of this.
It did play, but he did manage to there was a little crossover, but he did, those rural voters, many of them are actually white, in the Rust Belt and whatnot, they are actually white votes, and he was able to capture them even more than he did in 2020. Yes, 2020 when he lost to Biden. So, it's an interesting election with many, many dimensions to analyze. I think what is important is how the Caribbean is going to respond to his presidency and how he is going to treat the Caribbean. Now, neither candidate, and this was surprising, especially from the Democrat perspective, really even mentioned the Caribbean in their campaign. Latin America even was ignored. Now, this is a trend that has been happening for a long time, since the end of the Cold War in 1989. They don't see the region being so important anymore because there's no socialist threat. There's not the possibility of another Cuban revolution. They're not really that interested because the ideological war, East-West conflict, the Cold War is over. However, there are still very, very strong ties between these countries. Trading arrangements, for example, immigration is a big issue between these countries. And most importantly, today is the issue of security. Because our drug problem, which foments, or should I say spawn, the gangs and the gun and arms trade is all linked to the United States. So the drugs are produced in South America, they're transshipped to the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago included, and then they are sent, the demand is from North America, the US included. So the US has traditionally been assisting us in this war against drugs, and which is basically a war against crime and a war against arms, because the arms are also coming from North America generally. We have some coming from South America now, including Venezuela, but traditionally they've come from North America, and there has been that partnership, but it has not been succeeding. But it is in the interests of the United States to curb this. It's a transnational security problem which the US needs to get more heavily involved in. And it would be interesting to see, because I think we were largely ignored by the Biden administration and by the Trump administration before him. With regard to transnational security, regional security, national security, and I think the U.S. government has a fundamental role to play to assist in the fight against crime. And so I think we have to look at that kind of partnership and the extent to which Trump is willing. Yeah. The other issue that is going to touch primarily Trinidad and Tobago is the dragon field gas deals. So our country's been involved. Our country's been involved in there's some contractual arrangements between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, contracts which we have never seen. Okay, we have never seen those contracts. I would love to see them, but the question is, what's going to happen now? Now, the U.S. government's traditionally been anti-socialist and therefore anti-Venezuela, anti-Chavez, anti-Maduro. There have been some relations, but it has been more bitter than sweet. Okay? And now Trump, it's more hardline against leftism, against socialism, which is a doctrine subscribed by Nicolas Maduro. So it will be left to be seen how Trump is going to look at that arrangement between Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela, and whether we can sustain it.
Yeah, very much so. First of all, let's look at the deport undocumented migrants. Is expected the biggest mass deportation of undocumented migrants in U.S. history. I mean, that may be easier said than done when you look at the legal ramifications and, of course, the logistics involved. But he's made it quite clear, promises made, promises kept. And how is that going to affect us?
Yes, and, he also has this, what is the word? I try to pin down that word. Don't give a damn kind of attitude. So you have to do as I say. You have to, that's a dictatorial kind of attitude. You have to do as I say. I am the great and almighty Donald Trump. And, not open to ideas, not open to listening, it has his way. He gets his media attention by that kind of renegade approach to everything. And, that personality, it's how it's going to play out globally. On the one hand, to deal with issues like Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, Russia, and Venezuela, Guyana, because the U.S. will have to come in and play a role there if that escalates. And also to engage regions like the Caribbean and Latin America. You have to be diplomatic. There is a certain protocol that you need to follow. And seems to be anti-protocol. He seems to be anti-rules. He is, I don't even want to use the rule revolutionary. He's just radical. He's radical.
Also, what stands out as well is the climate regulations. He intends to cut climate regulation, as you know, to help the American car industry. He's made it quite clear he's not a supporter of electric vehicles. And of course, he's pledged to increase production of U.S. fossil fuels, vowing to drill. He made it quite clear, drill, drill, drill. Where does that put us?
So that is understandable, in as much as many of his financials come from that group, Halliburton and, a lot of these energy companies, and they're Trump supporters, Republican supporters, I should say. And so he has to protect those industries. Where does it leave us? If we were drilling, if we had more fossil fuels, crude oil and natural gas, it would all go well for us. But as it is now, we are in a bind because we have not been producing. We have not been producing enough. We've actually closed down our refinery and we're buying oil, refined crude oil, and we have not gone alternative. We have not engaged solar energy, biofuels, and all the other types of alternative sources of energy. We have not. So we are in a bind one way or the other, Trump or no Trump, with regard to that.
Yeah. He's also made it clear to end the Ukraine war. He wants the U.S. to disentangle itself from all foreign conflicts. And he's a staunch supporter of Israel, but he has made it clear to the Israel administration that they need to stop operations in Gaza.
Well, he would say that, and I think Biden said it many times as well, but they weren't doing anything about it. So I would want to wait and see what he would do, what he's going to do about, and Putin was his ally, if you recall. Putin used to be his ally. So I would want to see how he is going to engage the Israelites, given that the Jewish lobby in the United States is still a very, very powerful force, many of whom support his regime as well.
Yeah, and sweeping tax cuts, of course, new tariffs of at least 10% on most foreign goods, and that, of course, he said, is to cut the trade deficit.
And that is going to affect us, because not just us, but most of the developing countries that are trading with them, the developed countries, the OECD will also be affected, but the developed countries more so because of their struggling economies. Because if our goods are going to be subject to 10% tariff in the US market, then that would not be attractive to the American population to buy, because the prices are going to be higher. They're going to pass on that price to the consumer.
And as far as reproductive legislation, I mean, do you think that the biggest loser last night was women?
I think that was overplayed. Quite frankly, I think Kamala Harris overplayed it. It was pretty much a gender issue. And I think that not the majority of the American population were interested in that issue. And I think a lot of time was being spent on it when other issues like the economy should have been at the forefront.
No, I agree with you, because Mr. Trump made it quite clear that he left it up to the states to decide what their policy is going to be on the issue of abortion. He made it quite clear that they are free to decide their own laws on abortion, but yet still she tried her best to gain some political mileage with that, and that was not the major issue. Now, preparing for a general election here in Trinidad and Tobago, crime, the economy, but there are other little pockets, of course, where there needs to be a message for different sectors of our society. And if we had to reach across in actually to get those who may not usually gravitate to an opposition or the case may be, what should that message be?
So, you're talking about certain enclaves, and so you have to practice, not just preach, a multi-ethnic policy and multi-ethnic rhetoric, but beyond rhetoric policy, where each of the groups, none feel disenfranchised, particularly these majority groups. None of them should feel disenfranchised. And there's another group that are suffering, that are graduating with undergraduate and master's degrees, our youths. Our youths are underemployed and unemployed. They have to reach out to our youths. Maybe that's why many of them are turning to crime, because there are no alternatives. So they have to reach out to that youth group as well. And they would always comprise, a large percentage of the votership of the electorate. So, we have ethnic groups, the religious groups are to some extent, not to such a large extent, but certainly the youths. Then you also have the aged, the aging population, who feel that the pension is not sufficient, for example, who are now more vulnerable to crimes. They are being targeted, as we know. A lot of the older people are being targeted. They feel unprotected, they feel vulnerable. That group they also have to look at, and that's a voting group. They've always been a voting group. So there are these enclaves that they have to reach out to. The population has to reach out to. Not just population, sorry, the politicians have to reach out to.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes many of the citizens feel that there are certain areas that politicians, political parties have drawn the line and don't enter as far as dealing with the banking situation. Many of the citizens have been crying out for better policies. They feel that they're at the mercy of the entire banking system, and yet still you don't hear much of this narrative on the platform. What are you going to do to protect us from these conglomerates that are going about basically saying, listen, if you whatever service, whether it be a loan or an overdraft, we will vacuum your account to get what is ours, and there is no buffing, no area, no gray area where we can have some sort of conversation.
And that is pretty much the business sector, the big business sector. But what about the forex problem, where we hear that a small group are benefiting from forex, while the rest of the population want a few $100s to go and make a vacation abroad, and they can't get it. And that's another group you have to look at. This vulnerable group, small and medium enterprises, right? Those people, the hairdressers, the cosmetologists, the barber, those the little people who are trying a thing, trying to make a living. But some of them have to bring products from abroad, and they need some foreign exchange. And it's ordinary people who are trying to go on a vacation abroad. So now the credit card restrictions, you buy a ticket, you buy a hotel, and by the time you get there, you have no more money in your credit card. What do you do?
Yeah, so true. Closing comments, go right ahead.
So I think closing comments, we want to see what are the overtures to Latin America and the Caribbean. We have to remember that Donald Trump didn't even know that Trinidad and Tobago was one country. He did make a comment about Trinidad and Tobago as two separate entities. So clearly he needs to educate himself. We can see the hard line approach coming back with regard to immigration. He campaigned on that. But more importantly, he needs to honor the trade agreements that we have. Otherwise, we are going to be in serious trouble, and we have to look carefully at his reaction to the current dragon field deals between our government and Venezuela.
All right. Thank you so much for taking time out. We'll be checking with you periodically, and best of luck as we prepare for the upcoming general election. Thank you so much again.
You're most welcome, and thank you for having me.
Have a good night.